Everyone, Mr. Banerjee, Mr. and other members of the audience, as well as on the panel. Before I begin, I must put a caveat here. I was asked to speak on this topic earlier, and I specifically expressed some reservations because I am a counsel in one of the matters, just like Mr. Banerjee said on the NRCon matter, he reserved his comments. And this is something last minute which I was informed. So I will confine myself to only those aspects which I think I can openly speak about, because I think that everyone agrees that there is a bit of an issue, and I won't go beyond that. I think essentially the whole aspect has been beautifully captured by Mr. Banerjee when he's put it to say that there is an issue between the seat aspect and the host aspect. Now, before we go further, what I would really like is if somebody can just help me, for the benefit of everyone in the audience, just to give you a bit of a grounding, bit of a, I think as a backgrounder on what exactly we are talking about, I'll extract certain passages of basically three judgments, Bhatia, then we'll look at Balco, we'll come back to Reliance after that, because I believe what is essential is the fact that if you look at any of the judgments on this topic post Bhatia, except Venture, where Venture again in the reported judgment there is no mention of what the seat was. I don't see too many judgments where the court has really gone into explaining its own dictum in Bhatia, what is implied and what is expressed. What the court has done in most of these cases is just roll it down. So you lay down a proposition of law because you are having some difficulty in coming to grips with the way a statute is worded, and then you don't give any guidance for parties in the future. What you see as a result is a clause that happened in Arsenovia versus Cruz City, and what you see then is, because courts abroad don't understand what you are doing, they say, well, we don't understand what's happening, we'll tell you how we are going to go about it. This isn't the first time this has happened. In fact, I'll tell you of this judgment called Tamil Nadu versus STCMS. There's something very similar had happened, and there, what happens in English law is, there is a rule of law that in matters of foreign law, you have to lead proof, which is why you need an evidence, which is why you need a witness. And as Sir told you, there you had Mr. Pinaki Mishra and Mr. Datar, who were both eminent counsels practicing in the Supreme Court, who led evidence. Now, they give evidence on this point, and the court says, I'm still not convinced. Now, in Tamil Nadu versus STCMS, if you see the reported judgment, Lord Justice Cook, there Mr. Jaitley was the witness, and he had testified on what is the position under Indian law as regards arbitrability of certain matters under the electricity law. And there again, what they say is, well, you didn't prove it to our satisfaction, so we'll presume it's how our law works. Your law must be working the same way. So you are going to get into more and more of these complicated situations until the law gets cleared up. And what I intend to show you today is, leave aside all other aspects. I mean, it is a law which is messed up. I, however, see that there is a certain degree of clarity if only you confine yourself to the question of seat. And to that aspect, there could not be any quarrel with the law. And I believe that Reliance is a judgment that requires some reconsideration by a larger bench of the court. To begin, if I can have para 32 of Bhatia. So, what happened in Bhatia? Now, if you look at all these judgments, it's basically been the foreign party in a contract which has come rushing to Indian courts and saying, help, you have jurisdiction. I know the seat is outside, but you need to still intervene. And Bhatia versus bulk trading, one of the parties was a Swiss party and the other guy was an Indian party. The contract said Paris is the seat of arbitration, Paris, France. Now, despite that, the foreign party comes to a district court in Indore and files a section 9. And what he tells the district court is, I know the seat is outside, but you need to interfere, because if you don't interfere, I will get an award, I will win in the arbitration, but what do I execute it against? This fellow will run away with all the money, I will have a paper award in my hand. So you need to make sure you protect me in section 9. I'm not asking for anything more. I think perhaps that is the reason the court did indulge him, because the court saw the unjustness of what would possibly happen if they refused to exercise jurisdiction. Now, interestingly here, he goes to the section 9 court, thereafter he goes to the High Court, and ultimately when the matter comes to Supreme Court, One of the aspects that is argued before the court is, if you will show me para 7 please. This is the submission. I want you to take a note of this. So this was Mr. Sen who was explaining, Mr. B. Sen, who was explaining that in this matter, arbitration is being held in Paris. So you are seated outside India. So if you are seated outside India, he submits that to such an arbitration, part 1 obviously cannot apply. Correct? And therefore he submits that section 9 and 17, since they fall in part 1, they can't apply and this can't be used in cases where the place of arbitration in India. Now what really happens? To this you must understand a bit of the background as to why this whole issue arose before the court. Now the Arbitration and Conciliation Act 96 is supposed to be India taking into account the modern developments because of the UNCITRAL model law of 85 and enacting a modern law to deal with matters of arbitration. If you look at the drafting history of the Arbitration Act, basically, and I did a little bit of homework on this when I was working on a matter, there was hardly any consultation except FICCI and a couple of these industry bodies which were consulted. There was no real effective consultation when the bill was being drafted. What happens after that is the bill is put to debate in Parliament. The Parliament never really gets a chance to debate it. And ultimately, out of the blue, the whole thing is put in the form of an ordinance and brought into force. As you all know, an ordinance lapses after 6 months in India. So the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, since it can't be enacted at that time, an ordinance is lapsing, they come by way of a second ordinance. So basically now you have 6 months plus 6 months. Second 6 months lapses. Third ordinance is promulgated. So 6 months, 12 months, now 6 more months. This third ordinance, this colleague of mine who was a practicing lawyer in the Delhi High Court, Gyanendra Kumar, he actually challenged it as an advocate in the High Court. So his ground was that this is a misuse of an ordinance making power and the government can't keep doing this. You come, you debate it in Parliament, let's make a fair law, but you can't just, shove in an ordinance every time and keep putting it back in, because it's a tolerable use of your power to make an ordinance. If you want to make an ordinance, it's because there's an emergent situation, there is some urgency. Now you can't really keep perpetuating it by saying 6, 6, 6, it just can't keep going on. So what happens is the matter is argued at length, but the government makes a submission in the High Court. I don't think there's a reported judgment, but you'll find it on Indian Qanun if you look for it. That's where I found it. The government takes shelter under this exception which was carved out in DC Wadhwa. DC Wadhwa, there was a similar issue and that had been taken up all the way to Supreme Court. And Supreme Court said, well, if there's a lot of pressure on, the lawmaking agency, here being the Parliament, then obviously in that sort of a limited situation, you can have repeat ordinances. The government makes that submission, court accepts that submission, and thereafter court says, all right, trade petition dismissed. This was a matter where the government really needed some help from the court because this was obviously something which was a situation which was exceptional. I don't know what happened to the matter after that because I looked for it, I didn't find anything of this matter being carried in appeal to a division bench or the Supreme Court. What happens is when the bill was ultimately placed in Parliament, if you look at the debates, the entire debate is on two aspects. First is the fact that why was this matter taken by way of an ordinance? Why was Parliament bypassed? So instead of our Parliament actually focusing on what the wording of the law is, the Parliament goes into the issue of how the hell did you bypass us? So the whole thing is of the opposition attacking the majority, the government on this aspect and saying you couldn't have done this. And the government tried to manage it saying there was something urgent, people had already started arbitrations. Now if we had not enacted this further, if we had not carried it further, those arbitrations would have gone into a limbo. But nobody is really debating on the substantive aspects of the law. Had that been done, you would have gone into the question of why is our law making peculiar departures from the language of the model law. The model law is fairly clear, it's been adopted all over the world. It's obviously a bunch of people who thought about it for a very long time, debated on it, decided this is the best possible way to achieve it, the wording. Why do you want to tinker with the wording? Small things, for instance, in 2.2 they removed the word only. If you look at which the second session today will be on, there's a divergence between how section 8 is worded and how 45 is worded. One is nobody is really debated on these questions. So what happens when Bhatia comes in, the court for the first time sees the law. And Mr. Sen was arguing on one side, the other side Mr. Sundaram was arguing. Mr. Sundaram puts it to the court, well you see, if the parliament's made a departure, you would have to take it that there's a deliberate departure. So now you have to interpret it knowing that there is a departure, and you have to give a meaning to it. And he makes out a very ingenious argument as to the fact that there are some instances where a party will genuinely be left remediless, A. B. If you don't interpret it the way we are looking at it, you will be leaving a genuine lacuna in the act, and court has to always interpret the law in such a way so as to make sure there is no lacuna left. So the court obviously gets into that sort of a complicated situation, and therefore it doesn't exclusively deal with this contention. If you read the entire judgment, this contention at para 7 is never really negative with a sort of detailed reasoning. All that the court does is the court takes the larger scheme of the act, and the court comes back to say, alright, let's come back to para 32. The court looks at 32 and says, we've looked at the whole act. We don't want to interpret the law in a way that it will be apparent that there is a lacuna in the act. We don't want to interpret the law in such a manner that somebody will be left remediless. So I think the best way to reconcile all these things is to interpret the law like this, which is in cases of international commercial arbitration held outside of India. So firstly, the court knows that in para 7 an argument has been taken that the seat is outside India, you shouldn't interfere. The court is specifically saying in that context, if there is an arbitration held outside India, which means the seat is outside India, Part 1 will still apply, unless parties by agreement, express or implied, exclude all or any of its provisions. So court never gives you any guidance. Now if you look at subsequent judgments on this point, there are lots of judgments after that you will see. Several of them are in the context of a section 9 coming in appeal to the Supreme Court. Most of them are in the context of an 11.6 which is filed naturally in the Supreme Court. Because an international commercial arbitration, as you would know, the section 11.6 would lie straight away to the Chief Justice, to the designate of the Chief Justice. The court doesn't explain what is express or implied. So the court, in the facts of every case, tries to shoehorn it and explain that, oh, A and B put together show that there is an implied exclusion. The court does not explain what is A, what is B, what is C. Now, Mr. Banerjee has taken considerable pains to explain to you that there are basically 2 out of 3 factors, 1 out of 3 factors, 3 out of 3 factors. But the way I would look at those judgments, my view would be, and this is a personal view of course, that I don't see the court making this effort. So when we are trying to ascribe a meaning to a judgment, you have to look at it the way the court is looking at it. The court is making no effort to do that because the court knows if it starts doing that, it's going to create more and more complications for itself. In fact, except DOSCO and Venture, I don't think there are any cases where the court has actually gone to the extent of accepting that Part 1 is excluded. If you look at the reported judgment in Venture, there is no discussion as to what the seat is. Although I can tell you on facts that I've seen that matter, the seat is actually outside. But anyway, that's not a part of the reported judgment, so we can't look at it in London. The seat is in London, correct? If you look at Reliance on the other hand, you have the benefit of all this being extracted in the judgment. Now, I would definitely tell you, considering the debate we are having today, it would benefit all of you to go back and read Justice Manmohan Singh's order in the Delhi High Court. You will find it on the website. Because it's only then that you get to contrast the two things. There are a lot of things which are not written in this judgment. You would get the benefit of that from his order. The way I read Bhatia in particular, if I see para 7 and I contrast it with para 32, and I accept the fact that there is a lot of lack of clarity, let us say, as to what implied or express exclusion is, I can show you that the ratio of this judgment still is, on the facts of this case, that if there is a contention taken that the arbitration, that here Part 1 will not apply because the seat is outside India, the court has rejected this contention. So, to the extent we can look at it, we have some guidance from Bhatia because we understand that seat is irrelevant. There may be 10 other factors you will take it into consideration, but all the factors you will take into consideration to decide whether Part 1 is excluded, Bhatia's own facts show you that seat is irrelevant. Now in this conclusion I would be fortified because if I look at Venture, it's the same thing that happens. Although in Venture, what the court does is the court goes into a slightly different tangent. The court looks into a non-obstante clause which existed in that case. And there the argument is taken that if you permit this to go forward, FEMA gets violated. If you allow this transfer of shares, FEMA gets violated, and this is an effort by one of the parties to evade the legal and regulatory scrutiny of Indian courts. So the court goes into that tangent and it doesn't go into Mr. Nariman's argument, and it says, well, We are not going to go into so far. We'll see the fact that what Mr. Venugopal argues is exactly what Bhatia has said. We don't need to go that far. We are saying that we have jurisdiction. So what happens is Bhatia, which is an innocuous situation, a party coming to an Indian court and saying, if I win in the arbitration, I'll be left remediless. That reasoning is certainly getting extrapolated to a 34, saying if they said it in the context of 9, it applies equally well in the context of 34 because it is part 1. Now, where I join issue with Reliance is if you can turn to Reliance, let's start at 36. Now, what happens in Reliance, as Mr. Banerjee explained to you, seat/venue was London. Now, what had happened in this case was, this was a production sharing contract of 1994, and this is another aspect that I will come back to at the end of my presentation. You have a production sharing contract of 94 between Enron, between the government, between Reliance, and there were 4 parties. There was ONGC as well, and ONGC is aggrieved by this judgment because they were not heard before this judgment was delivered. But there were 4 parties. What happens is, in the year 2004, Enron goes bankrupt, as you all know, and you have British Gas which steps into the shoes of Enron. When Enron was there, because it was an American party, they had kept it as London. The moment British Gas stepped in, they had said that we will shift it to Paris. Because you always want arbitration to be held at a neutral venue. You don't want to arbitrate in the other person's backyard. Thereafter, what happened, there is an amendment made which says seat/venue. Seat/venue will be Paris. That is the second amendment when these guys come in. Now that is anybody's guess right now why this amendment was made. We shouldn't go into it. It's not safe to go into it. But one way of definitely looking into it is the fact that the parties had the option of saying seat Paris. They said seat/venue Paris. It should have some bearing here. I won't go further than that, but there are definitely more factual aspects which, as and when the court decides, we can all decide. We can debate about those things here. Thereafter, when the arbitration proceedings begin, the 3 parties in the arbitration, which is Reliance, British Gas and the government, they sign a consent award. They say that we agreed that the juridical seat for the purposes of this will be London. Curiously, when this consent award is signed and you have the date here, 14th of September 2011, what you can do is you can go back and check the date of the judgment of the Supreme Court in Videocon. Videocon was already decided by this time. Videocon, something similar happened. What happened? You have a SARS epidemic breaking out in Kuala Lumpur. Because of that, the party signed some consent award. But there is no signed agreement between the parties, it's just a consent award. By that, they seek to say that the seat is transferred. When it comes to the Supreme Court in 11, the Supreme Court says, sorry, that is not permissible. At best, what we will construe this is to mean that the venue has been altered by a consent award. There is no change of the seat. You have a similar situation here. There is no agreement, although the judgment actually erroneously records it, but there is just a consent award in this case. What happens after that is you go to the Delhi High Court and you tell the Delhi High Court that factually you are in a situation, which is why I told you this is nonsense. If you look at the whole matter, there is actually no agreement as to what the seat is. So you have to decide it as if there is no agreement as to seat. Which is why the Delhi High Court, there is a lot of discussion on the closest and real connection, which is the English approach, as Mr. Banerjee told you. Now that judgment, when it gets challenged in the Supreme Court, Justice Nijjar had the benefit of delivering a judgment in Balco by that time. What happens is, and this is my reading of Reliance, he retrospectively applies Balco to the facts of Reliance. Now in Balco, what happens, and again for this I'll have to take you slightly, I will have to digress and take you to Balco, but if you can just go a little further here, what the court does in para 45 in Reliance, or para 40, we can start with 43. The court is told of the fact that there is no intention to exclude the applicability of the Arbitration Act. The expression laws of India would include. Now, this 32.2 was a non-obstante clause just like in Venture. And the court had seen in Venture that, okay, if there is a non-obstante clause, we will give it a special meaning, which is why the argument is taken here. So, there is an argument here made that the arbitration clause is not really separable from the rest of the contract. Now if you come to 45, the court doesn't really go into that question so much in the next one. What the court says in 45 is very important. One line. It is too late in the day to contend that the seat of arbitration is not analogous to an exclusive jurisdiction clause. This view of ours will find support from numerous judgments of this court. Once parties has consciously agreed that the juridical seat would be London and that the arbitration agreement will be governed by the laws of England, it is no longer open to them to contend that the provisions of Part 1 of the Act will be applicable to the arbitration agreement. So what the court is basically saying is, you said London is the seat. That means Part 1 is excluded. And the second aspect, it says that the reason it says so, it says that agreement as to London being the seat is in the nature of an exclusive jurisdiction clause. Now if you give me para 110 of Balco. So this is Balco's judgment. Now in Balco, what is the court looking at? The court is looking at the fact that there is a reference made to a constitution bench saying Bhatia is not correctly decided, Venture is not correctly decided. You need to look at the correctness of these judgments and you need to lay down what is the scope and ambit of the act. The court goes through the entire ambit of what happens because you apply Bhatia and Venture. So the first thing that the court does is the court actually compares what happens in Venture, post Bhatia and Venture in India, with the law obtaining in England on a similar aspect. And English courts, as Mr. Banerjee explained, they are deciding the question on a slightly different aspect. But you are selectively quoting from some aspects of English law here. English law, what Shashua lays down here, and I have italicized that part, an agreement as to the seat of an arbitration brought in the law of that country as the curial law is analogous to an exclusive jurisdiction clause. So this is the position in England. Now here the court is going into the fact that if the parties agree that it will be made only in the courts of the place designated as the seat, it's akin to an exclusive jurisdiction clause. Now the next paragraph. No, before that. Yeah. So they say, if you see the bottom of that part, on the basis of what I've already decided, England is the seat of arbitration, and since this carries with it something akin to an exclusive jurisdiction clause as a matter of principle, the foreign court should not decide matters. So this is Shashua getting discussed by the Constitution bench in Balco. If you go further, now what happens? This entire argument is placed before the court to explain to the court that look, you need to make sure you adopt a similar standard, because if you don't, you create a chaotic situation where you have the courts of two countries. One is the seat country's court. So here if London is the seat, then English courts are naturally exercising jurisdiction. But you have in parallel Indian courts exercising jurisdiction because you have a judgment of your court saying even if the seat is England, we will exercise jurisdiction. So it creates a chaos. So there is a submission made by Mr. Sundaram again. He was arguing this matter as well, where he says that it's fine. You can make sure that there is a possibility of two courts having a concurrent jurisdiction to another. What he actually takes reference to 5(2)(b) of the New York Convention to say that the New York Convention itself admits of such an interpretation. But the court says, in our opinion, interpreting this in the manner suggested by Mr. Sundaram will lead to practical problems. So if you come to the next paragraph. So the court is explaining, if I accept your two-seat theory or two-nation theory as you put it, or whatever, two-court theory, it creates serious practical problems. So the court, what it says is, accepting the submissions, in the middle of the paragraph if you can see, accepting the submission made by Mr. Sundaram would lead to unnecessary confusion. There can be only one court with jurisdiction to set aside the award. There is a public policy consideration apparent favoring the interpretation that so and so. This public policy aspect was considered in C versus D. Next slide, please. And it was pointed out that this would be a recipe for litigation and confusion. It could not be supposed that the aggrieved party could complain in one jurisdiction and the satisfied party will. So you're looking at the court is understanding it leads to a conflicting situation. You can have conflicting judgments of two courts as well. The next slide. And the court is particularly aware that if because of its judgment in Bhatia, which has been followed in Venture, the court says this situation is, the creation of the situation is apparent from Venture. The award was made by LCI and so filed a petition. So the court is specifically noticing that this is a chaotic situation. You have Indian courts, you have, in fact, Venture is I think still pending in the Supreme Court even now. It is still pending even in Supreme Court today, in parallel. Let's go to the next slide. There was a part at the bottom of para 141. Can you just extract that? This is the paragraph. Anyway, I'll just tell you. So what the code does is the quote at the bottom of para 141, if you read sometimes, it says if I accept this contention, it leads to a chaotic situation. The word the code uses is it leads to a chaotic situation, and the code doesn't want this chaotic situation. Now the question you must ask yourself is if the court is particularly aware of the fact that a problem like this exists. The court has discussed the two nation or the two country, two seat aspect and noticed that it creates a chaos and says permitting this leads to a chaotic situation. It would be natural for the court to then take a conclusion that fine, let the whole thing get overruled. But the court doesn't do that. If you take it to the next slide. The court says whatever I say, I am overruling all these, but my ratio will only apply to cases involving arbitration agreements executed after the date of this judgment. So the judgment is delivered in September of 2012. If you have two parties which have executed an arbitration agreement prior to the date of the judgment, the court wants the two nation theory to continue applying. The court knows that it is a particular reality. The court sees that there are two courts exercising jurisdiction, but because the court does not want to create a different sort of a chaos, which would result if you rewrote everyone's agreement. Let's say you have a situation like Arsanovia. Two parties are absolutely clear about the fact that we need to exclude part 1 because there is a judgment called Bhatia. Now the court says we overrule Bhatia from day 1. What happens to their agreement? So the court particularly wanted to avoid this sort of a situation, which means the court understood that this two-court approach will continue for all parties who are prior to September 2012. Now Reliance, as I told you, is 22nd of December 2012. What the court does is, if you show me para 57 of Reliance, see the second line. The conclusion reached by the High Court would lead to the chaotic situation where the parties would be left rushing between India and England for redressal of their grievances. It's the same judge who's written the judgment, with all due respect. But what happens is the court, in its wisdom in Balco, in my view, settled the law. The court said, yes, this is what Bhatia says. Yes, Bhatia was interpreted in venture. So Bhatia got, rather I would say, affirmed in venture. Now we are setting to rest as a constitution bench the controversy. This is the law. There is no lack of clarity. This is very much the law. We are understanding this leads to this situation, and we are laying down that this will apply to everyone prior to our judgment. I would read para 197 to mean this. And we are also simultaneously laying down that this will not apply to any arbitration agreement after September 2012. So if you laid down the law by a constitution bench saying you must live with the chaos if your arbitration agreement is prior to September 2012, what have you done in Reliance? You have basically taken the language, your thoughts, your underlying tenor of your judgment in Balco, and you said, there's a friend of mine, Ashwin Matthew, who wrote a very interesting article, where he said the court felt that it was an unfair outcome, putting people in Reliance through the Bhatia loop. And therefore to ensure that there is no unfairness, the court found a way to give them relief. I would not put it so far. I would pitch it slightly lower to say this. You have the Arbitration and Conciliation Act enacted in 96. You have Bhatia, which comes in 2003. You have Venture, which comes in 2008. If you look at the facts of Reliance, the production sharing contract is of 94. Could the parties have even foreseen that there will be a 96 Act? Forget an interpretation of that Act in Bhatia. Now when the court laid down its conclusion in para 97 of Balco that whatever we are saying this will apply to arbitration agreements for the future, what the court also did is for unfortunate people like the situation of a contract of 94 where the parties were still under the 1940 Act. And if I actually think what would have possibly been in the minds of the parties is the Supreme Court's judgment in NTPC versus Singer, because that was 93 Supreme Court. So the parties were trying to, or must have grappled with the fact that this is the position of law obtaining as of 94. Let's keep this in mind and sign an arbitration agreement which will govern us for the next 25 years. By a judgment of a court, now you are asking them to do something which they had never bargained to do. So the way I would I would put, I mean, in a sense, I agree with what Ashwin says, but the way I would put it is the court in para 197 of BALCO actually created more complications than it would have imagined. One is an instance of Reliance here where it's almost rewritten the contract between the parties because it says, I don't care what you wrote, I will take it that you should have said this. If you didn't say this, now I say you are governed by this. And I think that is a practical problem because of para 197 of BALCO, which will arise in the future again and again, because I'm sure there are lots of parties who have contracts with the government, as Mr. Banerjee said, and I'm sure there will be private parties as well, who will have contracts which will be prior to September 2012. This is too early right now to say that they won't mature into disputes. You might see the next 3, 4, 5 years of litigation where you will have those sort of arbitration agreements which will come in, and there I would say that the law has actually been settled by BALCO as to what happens pre-BALCO. And what has been done in Bhatia and what has been done in Venture has been upheld, allowed, and in fact affirmed by a constitution bench saying, no, this, you must live with this chaos. And I think that is a situation when possibly Reliance may get tested, because I don't know what will happen now that we have Harmony where, with all due respect, this aspect has not even been argued. So Harmony also doesn't consider the fact that of all the things relevant or irrelevant that Bhatia could have said, on its own facts, if the seat theory was rejected in Bhatia, then surely the seat couldn't have been the consideration in Reliance. And I'm sure in some matters, maybe Mr. Banerjee will, he will be able to tell you better if there are any upcoming matters where possibly this aspect may get argued. And the court may have an occasion to actually consider this, because just keep in mind, Reliance is by a bench of 2 judges and Bhatia is by a bench of 3 judges. So Bhatia couldn't have, if they had any doubts as to this aspect, they could have at best referred it to a larger bench. Reliance could not have surely held something contrary to what Bhatia did. Now coming back to the aspect of Arsenovia, and Sir has dilated on a fair few aspects of it. I'll only add one more thing in the aftermath of Arsenovia. I think one more aspect which is extremely important, which arbitrators or courts haven't considered, is the fact that when parties specify a seat, it is not only an exclusive jurisdiction clause as English courts hold. I think it goes a step further. The moment a seat attaches to an arbitration, that seat by a legal fiction continues no matter where the tribunal sits. What happens as a consequence, according to me, is the fact that there are certain mandatory provisions of law that attach to that seat. One aspect in my view would be arbitrability. So let us say you have a contract which says that governing law, Indian law, a lot of these contracts are there. You have a seat which is, let us say, India. But you have a clause that says the law of the arbitration agreement, which eventually will govern the arbitrability here. Law of the arbitration agreement is English law. Now, if you apply the judgment of Lord Justice Coke, I told you, where Mr. Jaitley had given evidence, there they say this aspect is arbitrable. So something which is governed by Indian law, but in English opinion, in the opinion of English courts, is arbitrable. They will say this is arbitrable. So therefore, an English lawyer, when he is arguing this aspect for an opposite party, where he is trying to canvass that point of view, he would place this judgment to say, well, this is our view on arbitrability. If you have agreed to the law of arbitration agreement in English law, it must be done in accordance with the way our courts have looked at it. There, my view would be, this is as a proposition of law, I am yet to see this seriously tested in India, although there are certain foreign courts where this has been done. What would be the effect of parties specifying a seat? Because the mandatory laws of that seat should, in my view, have the effect of striking out with a blue pencil everything inconsistent said in the contract as to what exists because of mandatory provisions of the seat. So, if let's say you chose Indian law and Indian governing law and a seat New Delhi, some aspects would not be arbitrable. So even if you agree to a law of arbitration agreement being English law, and it is said that no, parties specifically agreed, it is their intention that this must be arbitrated, you would say, but the seat overrides. In my view, the seat must override, because you cannot have a contract against public policy, and the moment you have a seat which is applying, this is my opinion, and I think we should hopefully we should see this getting tested sometime soon. Because what happens, if we go by the Bhatia approach and the seat is paramount, and you have a seat which is abroad or you have a seat in India, the effect of that agreement as to the seat has to be argued and tested in some matter before the court. Let's see then what courts have to say. My view would be it would have the effect of overriding the agreement of the parties to the contrary. I think most of the other aspects have been covered. Yes, Harmony missed the bus on both counts, both on the counts of doubting reliance, which should have been done, and second on the aspect of 9 versus 47 and 48. But that's not the end of the board, because I think Harmony would be taken to be per incurium on this aspect, and I think unless you raise a contention to this aspect, the court is not compelled to look at it. I'm hoping sometime it will be done soon. What I can tell you, because again I have been involved in this matter, is this is a matter which has been raised in the Supreme Court in one matter, and hopefully now the court has obviously gone into vacations, but after the court comes out of vacation, I think the vacation is over. I think sometime in July the court will start hearing this matter again. So it should be interesting, and I'm sure if it happens it will be a reported judgment, and you guys should take a look at it. It should be very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rana, for illuminating us on the very important point that how the court is going to interpret the intention of the parties when, especially in context of reliance, when the agreement is entered pre the Arbitration and Conciliation Act even, and also discussing the very complicated issue of what is the implication of having a different law governing the arbitration agreement than the seat of the arbitration and the lex arbitrae. Now I would like to have Daniel Matthew to discuss his views on the issue of the first session.
It's almost one, which means I'm in a very hazardous zone that I'm standing between you and your lunch. So, considering the position that I am in, which is most of which what could be said has been said, with far more interesting anecdotes than what maybe I could present from our class discussions. So, rather than going into and discussing in substantive detail what the case has said and other things, let me just throw out a couple of ideas and do it in very quickly, and maybe we could have some discussions afterwards. Right? One of the things that sort of got discussed consistently out here is this odd behavior that is sort of creeping into arbitration, adjudication, of looking at English court decisions, pulling them up, and then just doing a CCP, right, standard ideas. And that has led to a couple of problems. And one of the things that has led to is introduction of certain new tests, if I could say. One of them is what got listed out here as the closest, most intimate connection test. Right? This was a test in the Indian jurisprudence, as Mr. Banerjee did tell you, that this is an English test. However, it was here for a while. NTPC used it, and this has been sort of used again and again. Citation got very close to using it. DOSCO makes a very obscure reference to it. Perhaps it really got its place in Enracom. And Mr. Banerjee very tactfully avoided all discussions on it. So let's try instigate and provoke him by discussing this. What is happening with closest and most intimate connection? The idea is, if you have a certain lack of clarity on what law applies, which court would adjudicate, which jurisdiction is the most should be the one which should assume jurisdiction. One of the ways of looking at it is just pick up this test and apply it. Now the problem that comes in is how do you apply it? And there are two ways of going about it, which sort of can be gleaned out from some of the cases that we have seen till now. One is the NTPC till citation, which says you look at the entire transaction, you look at everything that surrounds it, look at the parties, look at where the obligation has to be discharged, look at where the contract was signed, everything about that matter, that transaction, then take a pick which jurisdiction is the closest. The other one, which is sort of very clearly let out, if you look at, say, Sulamerica and others, is that you don't look at the entire matter, you look at which jurisdiction is the closest connection to the arbitral proceedings, and then take a call, right? Two ideas, two standard ideas. And Enracom does a very interesting thing. On one paragraph it says the closest connection to arbitral proceedings, and it goes a couple of paragraphs down and says in totality of the matter, right? So the bench which should have sort of could have looked at it and to try and decide which way would you go, has sort of said we use closest connection test, and it's something that we would utilize, but why we do it and what are the parameters we would do it, and whether or not it will be a primary test is something that we are not going to say or talk much about. Just a heads up, when Suleiman and others utilize it, they use the closest connection test only when seat is mentioned, and the rest of the things have to be sort of pulled out. Indian courts have been fairly silent about it. So that's one question which remains open for us to see what perhaps could or could not be done. Another thing that sort of comes up is this growing importance of the proper law of arbitration agreement, or governing law of arbitration agreement, if you may, right? And the two cases, both of them got extensively discussed, is the Videocon and Reliance, right? And if you look at Videocon, I think one of the last paragraphs, 33, it just throws up everything in the wind and says, since the proper law of arbitration agreement is the English law, that jurisdiction, part 1 is excluded. Reliance comes in, as it was just informed to you, before it got to the exclusive jurisdiction clause of C, was, I think, fairly fine in paragraph, I think I just made a note somewhere, and I can't read my own writing. Just fine. comes back and says, because it's the proper law of arbitration agreement is English, that's good enough for us to say that part 1 is ousted. So you now do see a point. It's only later, I think just a couple of paragraphs down, it says the two ideas that there's a foreign seat, there's a proper law of arbitration agreement which is English, so the two combined is an exclusion. If you just sort of ignore that for the moment, you do see a virtual affirmation, and does that, affirming on Videocon to say proper law of arbitration agreement in itself is a good exclusion point. Which is I think a fairly interesting thing, because if that is so the case, then how do you reconcile, as was just being pointed out by Mr. Panda here, how do you reconcile it with NTPC? Because NTPC, quoting again the English decisions and Mutsuven Boyd and others on this, came up and said that if there is no proper law of arbitration agreement, then this governing law would tend to follow the proper law of contract, because it's part of that contract, right? And NTPC sort of, all the cases that flow back, Intel, Citation, and all the others who come out, sort of tend to keep referring back to NTPC. So where do you place this? I mean, one way of distinguishing it, of course, could be that in both Videocon and Reliance, the proper law of arbitration agreement was explicitly mentioned, right? And NTPC was talking about a situation where that's not the case. But even otherwise, how far do you push this idea that the proper law of arbitration agreement now is getting out to be one of the major determinative factor? The third thing is, and I think that was very interesting, and I hope we could have some discussions on this, was this complete movement away from no importance to seat in Bhatia, all the way down to seat being an almost exclusive jurisdiction clause and everything else can be sort of ignored. Till the time that decision gets looked at in detail, until the time this matter gets settled down, you are now looking at a range of almost a decade plus 2 or 3 years of judgments, 7 to 8 major ones, where the pendulum has swung completely from no seat all the way down to seat. And interestingly, this got started by DOSCO, right? So if you look at the combinations which come up, in everything where exclusion has happened after DOSCO, Yograj, Videocon, Reliance, yeah, in all of these, the seat has been sort of one of the factors which has been looked at, right? And said seat plus something else is exclusion. Of course, we might have issues with Yograj, because Yograj comes and says seat plus the foreign lex arbitrary is an exclusion. And that was a problem area, because both Sumitomo and NTPC sort of vaguely suggest that if nothing else is mentioned, only seat is mentioned, then the law of the seat would be the governing law of arbitration. So that's another interesting area, an open area, and it's curious why that is happening. One of the suggestions that we did discuss in class, and of course we have no way placed to respond to this, is looking at the judge who was giving the decision, right? And I think Mr. Panda let the cat out of the bag here when he said that you had that in Reliance, what really happened was trying to get backdoor entry into the regime. So is that really happening? So have we now within Bhatia regime now come to give seat a rather exclusive place or rather important place? That is, there cannot be an exclusion unless seat gets mentioned, which is essentially what happened in Enercon also, right? Enercon, the clear idea was venue is London, it's not the seat. The rest everything points to India, and therefore India is the governing law. There are quite a few other points, but I think they all have been raised. I will end here, and I hope we could have a little more enlightening discussion from all of you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dhananjay.